Very few people ask, though, what's actually on the Rosetta Stone? What is written here? What mysteries of ancient Egyptian life? Over decades of hard work, we started to be able to translate hieroglyphics.
For 2 centuries, the world was certain it had mastered every word carved into the Rosetta Stone. Academics decoded it, classrooms taught it, institutions displayed it behind glass. The matter was settled.
Scientists have developed a new AI that can now read ancient texts with a staggering 98% accuracy, surpassing the reliability of the stone itself. Today, we are looking at how artificial intelligence is cracking codes that have been silent for millennia, and why history as we know it is about to be rewritten.
Modern AI system was fed the complete trilingual inscription and asked to analyze it from scratch. It flagged something that every human expert across 200 years of scholarship had walked right past. The hieroglyphic version and the Greek version are not conveying the same meaning, not in the sections that count most. What generations of students have been taught may only represent the topmost layer of the text. Beneath it, ancient scribes may have embedded an entirely different message, one crafted for a specific audience no one had ever considered. What this algorithm uncovered inside a 2,200-year-old slab of stone is now forcing Egyptologists to revisit a question they believed was permanently closed in 1822, the stone that rewrote history. More than 2 millennia ago, somewhere inside a workshop in ancient Egypt, a group of highly trained scribes took up their tools and began cutting a message into a block of dark granodiorite. They weren't writing for themselves. They were writing for kings, for priests, for people they would never meet and could never name. What they left behind would lie buried, fractured, and silent beneath Egyptian soil for nearly 15 centuries, until one afternoon in July of 1799, a French soldier's shovel struck something solid in the mud near the Egyptian port of Rosetta. Napoleon Bonaparte's army had entered Egypt the year before, driven by imperial ambition and an almost obsessive hunger for the ancient world. Traveling alongside the soldiers was an entire corps of civilian experts, scholars, scientists, illustrators, and engineers, charged with documenting every dimension of Egypt's extraordinary past. They sketched temples, measured pyramids, and loaded artifacts onto waiting ships. And when that shovel connected with stone near the town now called Rashid, no one present understood what had just been found. What the soldier unearthed was not gold. It was not a hidden tomb or a buried city. It was a battered, irregular slab of rock covered in 3 different writing systems.
Represents the same text in 3 different languages. Up at the top, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. In the middle, a kind of cursive and later hieroglyphic called demotic. And down at the bottom, the key to the enterprise, Greek.
By the standards of treasure hunting, it was unremarkable. Stained, incomplete, missing its upper corners, cracked along one side, and yet encoded within those 3 parallel columns of ancient script was the answer to a puzzle that had defeated the world's finest minds for 1,500 years. The object became known as the Rosetta Stone, and from the moment of its discovery, it transformed human understanding. First, it reshaped everything we knew about ancient Egypt. Now, 2 centuries later, artificial intelligence is forcing us to ask whether that transformation is still unfolding. What the French military did next set the conditions for everything that followed. British forces eventually took possession of the stone from Napoleon's army under the 1801 Treaty of Alexandria, and it was transported to London, where it has remained ever since, on continuous public display at the British Museum from 1802 onward, making it one of the longest-running exhibitions of any single object anywhere in the world. Millions of people have stood before it. Hundreds of scholars have examined it, and for most of those 2 centuries, a firm consensus held. This was a key that had already surrendered everything it had to offer. That consensus is now fracturing, and the instrument doing the fracturing doesn't sleep, doesn't carry assumptions, and arrives with none of the 2 centuries of interpretive habit that shaped every human reading before it, a language the world had forgotten. To grasp why the Rosetta Stone carried such weight, you have to appreciate how completely the ability to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics had vanished from human memory. This was not a partial gap in knowledge, it was total. For centuries, travelers and scholars had made their way to Egypt and stood before colossal temples, carved obelisks, and elaborately painted tomb walls, all of them dense with extraordinary symbols. Birds, eyes, waves, serpents, seated human figures, geometric forms, hands, reeds, beautiful, ubiquitous, and absolutely impenetrable. The same inscription in 3 scripts: hieroglyphics, Demotic, and critically, ancient Greek, the one language that had never been lost. Here was the problem. The last known person capable of reading Egyptian hieroglyphics in the ancient world died sometime around 394 AD. After that, the knowledge simply stopped existing. The Roman world consolidated its grip. Christianity spread across the Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptian temples were shuttered, repurposed, or left to erode in the desert. The scribes who had devoted their entire lives to mastering the sacred script left behind no students, no apprentices, no one prepared to carry the tradition forward. Within a generation or two, 5,000 years of accumulated writing, theology, science, royal records, poetry, history became completely unreadable to anyone alive. And what made it worse was that brilliant people never stopped trying. For over a millennium, scholars from across the world attacked the problem and produced nothing usable. Medieval Islamic academics approached the symbols with serious scholarly intent and failed. Renaissance Europeans hauled Egyptian obelisks to Rome and Paris, admiring them without understanding a single carved character. By the 18th century, some of Europe's most celebrated academic figures had published elaborate, confident explanations of what hieroglyphics meant. They were meticulous. They were wrong. The most persistent error was treating hieroglyphics as purely conceptual, assuming each image stood for an idea rather than a sound. Entire volumes explained that a hawk symbolized the soul, a circle represented eternity, a serpent signaled danger. It felt like the kind of deep, symbolic system that an ancient civilization ought to have used. It was a complete dead end. The reality was far more layered. Hieroglyphics were not a pictorial code. They were a sophisticated writing system that combined phonetic signs, symbols representing sounds, with ideographic elements and semantic classifiers. A single bird image might represent a specific spoken sound in one context and function as a category marker in another. The system had interlocking strata, and without a key connecting those strata to a known language, there was no way through. For 15 centuries, the barrier held. Then a French soldier's spade opened the smallest possible crack in it. What the algorithm would find inside that crack 2 centuries later was something no one in 1799 could have predicted, and something no one in 1822 thought to look for. 3 scripts, 1 message. When French scholars first examined the stone, what struck them immediately was not just its age. It was the architecture of the inscription. The stone carried not 1 script, but 3. At the top, hieroglyphics, the formal, sacred writing used for religious ceremonies and royal monuments. In the middle, Demotic, a faster, more fluid Egyptian script used in daily life for contracts, legal documents, and correspondence. At the bottom, Ancient Greek, the administrative language of Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, when the ruling pharaohs were themselves Greek-speaking descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. And critically, all 3 sections appeared to contain the same message. Scholars recognized the Greek immediately. It was a decree, a formal royal proclamation issued in 196 BC by a council of Egyptian priests honoring the young pharaoh Ptolemy V Epiphanes on the 1st anniversary of his coronation. Tax reductions, temple endowments, military victories in ceremonial summary, orders for statues of the king to be erected throughout Egypt, bureaucratic language, official, formulaic, carefully constructed, the kind of text every government in every age produces. But because the Greek version was readable, something became possible that had never been possible before: a direct, side-by-side comparison between a known text and 2 unknown scripts, symbol by symbol, word by word. For the first time in 1,500 years, a scholar held a map. The race to use it was intense. Swedish diplomat Johan Åkerblad made early progress identifying proper names in the Demotic section, but the first genuinely decisive breakthrough came from British physicist Thomas Young. Working at his desk in London in 1814, surrounded by hand-copied sections of the stone's inscriptions, Young noticed that one particular group of hieroglyphic symbols kept recurring, always enclosed within an oval loop, what Egyptologists call a cartouche. The cartouche appeared wherever the Greek text used the name Ptolemy. Young looked at this, leaned forward, and understood something fundamental. If the oval consistently corresponded to a royal name in the Greek version, then the symbols inside it weren't representing ideas. They were representing sounds, specific phonetic sounds that spelled out a name. He pushed back from his desk and wrote it down. That was the crack. Not a system, not a full translation, one locked door swinging open for the first time in 15 centuries. The complete working framework came from a French linguist named Jean-François Champollion. Champollion had been consumed by ancient Egypt since childhood. He had devoted himself to every ancient language he could find, and crucially, he had mastered Coptic, the final surviving form of the Egyptian language. Preserved within the liturgical tradition of Egyptian Christianity, this was his decisive advantage. Coptic preserved the actual spoken sounds of ancient Egyptian, written in a Greek alphabet. Champollion could use it as an acoustic bridge, a living echo of a dead language, connecting the visual symbols of hieroglyphics to spoken sounds that had been silent for 15 centuries. He worked for years, not months. The room in Paris where it finally came together in September 1822 smelled of candle wax and old paper. His notes covered every available surface. He had barely slept in weeks. When the last piece locked into place, Champollion walked out of his study and found his brother Jacques-Joseph in the hallway, grabbed him by both arms, and said 4 words: "J'ai tenu l'affaire." I've got it. Then he collapsed. He was unconscious for 5 full days. When he opened his eyes and his brother bent over him, the first question Champollion asked was whether his notes were safe. They were, and the world changed. What the stone said, and why it wasn't enough. Once the decipherment was complete, and scholars rendered the full text into modern languages, the outcome was thoroughly anticlimactic. No hidden wisdom, no lost doctrine, no secret ritual. The Rosetta Stone, the artifact that had unlocked the entire written world of ancient Egypt, was itself just an administrative notice, a priestly council formally recognizing a teenage king on the anniversary of his coronation. Tax policy, temple endowments, military summaries, and ceremonial language. Case closed. For 200 years, that verdict stood. Textbooks repeated it. Museums displayed it. The Rosetta Stone was historically priceless as a linguistic instrument, and personally unremarkable as a document. Everyone agreed. Everyone moved on. But here is what no one anticipated. In the 21st century, a computational linguistics model would train itself on that same text, the same decree everyone had read, translated, cited, and set aside, and surface something 200 years of human scholarship had entirely missed. The algorithm did not agree that the stone was unremarkable, not even slightly. The AI enters the room. This is where the story stops being history and starts being something else. A research team led by Dr. Marco Palazzi at University College London undertook a systematic computational analysis of the Rosetta Stone's trilingual inscription. Their methodology was fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Rather than translating the text, work that had already been done and refined over 2 centuries, the model was instructed to map statistical relationships across all 3 language versions simultaneously, treating the inscription not as a document to be read, but as a data structure to be interrogated. Dr. Palazzi described the moment the system returned its first results as quietly disorienting. The team had expected one of 2 things: either confirmation that the existing translation was complete, or scattered statistical noise with no interpretable signal. What the model produced instead was something with a recognizable shape. The flag divergences weren't distributed evenly across the text. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, one visible the instant the output was rendered visually. He printed the results according to colleagues who were present, held the page at arm's length for a long moment, and then said one thing: run it again. It ran again. The flags appeared in exactly the same locations, the same category of passage, the same directional divergence between the Greek and hieroglyphic versions every single time. Here is what the model identified, not in abstract statistical terms, but in plain, concrete language. In section 14 of the decree, the passage describing the king's donations to the temples, the hieroglyphic version uses a particular formulation that appears 3 times in close succession. In standard Egyptian ceremonial writing of the Ptolemaic period, that that same formulation appears once per passage. Repetition of that specific construction in priestly administrative texts was a recognized signal, a formal, legally binding clause, not merely honorific language. The Greek text at the same location uses a single honorific phrase. Gracious, routine, the sort of sentence a speechwriter produces without thinking. The gap is specific, concrete, and strange. Where the Greek says the king gave generously to the temples, the hieroglyphic version appears to say the king is permanently and formally bound to give to the temples, with the full legal weight of priestly law behind it. That is not a translation discrepancy. That is not grammatical variance between two languages. That is a different message, delivered in the same document, at the same location, to two different audiences. And what makes it genuinely strange is where these divergences cluster. They don't appear throughout the text at random. The algorithm found that they concentrate in a specific category of passage. Every instance where the decree addresses the relationship between royal authority and priestly economic rights. In passages covering military campaigns and public construction, all three language versions align almost perfectly, but the moment the decree turns to temple authority, priestly land rights, and the limits of royal power over sacred property, the model consistently identifies structural divergences with no satisfactory linguistic explanation. 17 instances, same category, same direction. The system identified a pattern, and it appeared to be a deliberate one. What the patterns mean. In ancient Egypt, layered communication within official texts would not have been unusual if intentional. Egyptian scribes were among the most educated professionals in the ancient world. They trained for decades, mastering not merely the mechanics of writing, but the art of what scholars call diglossia, the capacity to use language differently for different audiences within the same document. But here was the problem. No one had ever approached the Rosetta Stone through that lens before. The universal assumption had always been that the three scripts were faithful equivalents of one another. The model didn't make that assumption. It treated all three versions as independent texts and asked a single direct question: do they agree? They didn't, not consistently, and not in the places that mattered most politically. What the algorithm appears to have surfaced is a negotiation encoded inside a ceremony. Scholars have long understood that the Ptolemaic pharaohs were navigating an extraordinarily delicate position. They were foreign rulers, Greek-speaking descendants of a Macedonian general, trying to maintain legitimacy with an ancient, deeply conservative Egyptian priestly class that wielded enormous institutional power. The priests controlled the temples. The temples controlled vast tracts of agricultural land, workshops, and economic infrastructure. The pharaohs needed the priests' public endorsement. The priests needed guarantees. And here is what no one had considered before the model ran. Those guarantees may have been written directly into the Rosetta Stone. Not in the Greek administrative layer that everyone studied, but in the hieroglyphic layer that only the priestly class could fully interpret. The stone may not have been a single decree. It may have been two separate agreements written onto the same rock for two different rooms. The debate among scholars. Not everyone accepts this reading, and the objections deserve serious consideration. Several prominent Egyptologists have offered pointed critiques of the computational analysis. Dr. Penelope Wilson of Durham University, one of the leading specialists in Ptolemaic priestly texts, has argued publicly that phrase repetition in hieroglyphic ceremonial writing is far more stylistically conventional than the model appears to account for. Egyptian scribes used formulaic repetition as a rhetorical device, not necessarily as a legal or encoded signal. Without a substantially larger corpus of comparable Ptolemaic-era priestly decrees analyzed under the same conditions, she argues, the statistical baseline is too narrow to support the divergence claims. The central methodological objection carries real weight. AI systems trained to detect patterns will find patterns, whether or not those patterns carry meaning. A sufficiently powerful model applied to any ancient text will surface statistical anomalies. The question is never whether anomalies exist. They always do. The question is whether they are intentional, and whether intent can be inferred by an algorithm operating across a cultural gap of 2,000 years. Here is where it becomes genuinely complicated. A model's training data matters enormously. Modern large language models learn from existing scholarship that has itself been shaped by centuries of human interpretation, all of which carries embedded assumptions about what ancient texts are and how they function. When the system flags a phrase as statistically unusual, it is comparing that phrase against patterns learned from other texts. If those other texts were themselves imperfectly understood, The model's comparison may rest on a foundation shakier than it first appears. But here is what even the skeptics have conceded. The model identified specific textual features, particular phrase clusters, particular cross-language divergences in passages concerning temple authority and priestly economic rights, that the existing scholarly literature has not adequately explained through conventional linguistic analysis. The debate is not whether those features are present. They are. The debate is what caused them. And that debate, dormant for 200 years, is now fully alive. What it would mean if the interpretation holds. If careful future scholarship confirms that the Rosetta Stone was deliberately constructed to carry layered communicative purposes, the implications extend far beyond a single artifact in a London museum. Every major inscription from the Ptolemaic period would need to be subjected to the same computational scrutiny. Hundreds of established translations would be open to revision. Decades of historical interpretation would need to be revisited. The model isn't suggesting we misread one decree. It's suggesting we may have fundamentally misread an entire category of ancient political communication. It would force a complete reassessment of the ancient Egyptian priestly class, not just their literary sophistication, but their institutional power. The proposition that religious officials could engineer a formal royal proclamation to serve their own interests while appearing simply to honor their king implies a level of strategic intelligence that traditional historical accounts have consistently underestimated. These were not passive administrators. They were architects of political language, sophisticated enough to mislead 2 centuries of modern scholarship. It also raises pointed questions about the Ptolemaic pharaohs themselves. Greek-speaking rulers holding together a kingdom of extraordinary cultural complexity. If they participated in the layered construction of their own official documents, that is not clumsy cultural imitation. That is sophisticated political theater performed simultaneously in 3 languages for 3 different audiences on a single piece of stone. It suggests that the celebrated cultural synthesis of the Ptolemaic period, Greek rulers observing Egyptian rituals, constructing Egyptian temples, commissioning Egyptian art, was not merely performance. It was negotiation, continuous, careful, and encoded directly into the monuments they left behind. The algorithm surfaced that possibility. It did not invent it. The stone was always carrying it. The stone still speaks. It sits today in the British Museum in London, inside a climate-controlled case under carefully calibrated conservation lighting. A broken slab of dark granodiorite, roughly the dimensions of a large headstone, covered in 3 bands of ancient text. Thousands of visitors pause in front of it every day. Most linger for about 45 seconds. They read the label, they take a photograph, then they move on, confident they understand what they are looking at. For 200 years, the Rosetta Stone has been celebrated as a key, the key that reopened the ancient Egyptian written world and returned to humanity the voice of a lost civilization. That story is entirely true. Champollion's decipherment remains one of history's most extraordinary intellectual achievements. The stone genuinely broke open 15 centuries of silence. But now the key itself is being examined. And what the model identified, what the algorithm found inside those phrase clusters and cross-language divergences, is the possibility that the Rosetta Stone was never simply a linguistic bridge. It may have been a political instrument, a coded negotiation, a monument deliberately engineered to mean different things to different readers, simultaneously on the same surface. The scribes who cut it were professionals of exceptional skill, operating in a world where language was the foundational technology of power, where writing was controlled by a tiny, educated elite, and where the gap between what a document said and what it meant could be precisely, deliberately, and invisibly constructed. They knew that most people would read the surface. They may have been counting on it. They were, in every meaningful sense, the original engineers of layered communication. And for 2,000 years, the layer they built beneath the official text sat undisturbed, waiting for something that could read without assumption, without expectation, and without the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of consensus dictating in advance what the answer was supposed to be. What the AI cannot tell us is whether those scribes had any conception that their work would outlast everything. The dynasty they served, the empire they inhabited, the language they wrote in. Whether they could have imagined their inscription being dug out of the mud by foreign soldiers, carried across the Mediterranean, placed behind glass in a city that did not exist when they were alive, and interrogated by a form of intelligence they had no framework to conceive of, one that would look at their carefully constructed document and immediately ask the one question no human scholar had thought to ask first. Are all three versions actually saying the same thing? What the model can tell us, what it has already told us, is that the translation we have been pointing to for 200 years as proof that we cracked the code may represent only the most visible layer of what is actually carved into that stone. The layer designed to be read, the layer built for everyone. The ancient world left us a stone and a question it was never fully pressed to answer. It left us a language we fought more than a century to recover. And now that we have recovered it, now that we hold that hard-won translation, that 200-year triumph of human scholarship, the stone is posing one final question. What if you only ever read the version they intended most people to see?